skaters are exceptionally bad, and I'm sorry if you have them. You should probably trade them. We probably all know who they are in this room. I know we see them on Twitter time and time again every night. A small portion of skaters are exceptionally good. It's great if you have them. You know the superstars, the elite. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So getting to that variables in the rush volume model. Pretty self-explanatory. Number of rush chances created for each continuous stint, where the same 10 skaters are on the ice, and there are the predictors. Similar to the rush quality model, except we're looking at expected goals. And as I said with that calculation, there's a lot of data that goes in behind that, and having it be accurate and having the sample size that matters is incredibly important. And at Stathletes, as a company, we've taken a lot of time and effort into collecting a decade of data the right way, doing the little things that add up in the long run to make great data very accurate and be able to collect it in such detail that it's meaningful in hockey. So, for the model results, we're looking at rush, chance creation, and suppression. To create a rush off an ozone draw, a team would have to leave the ozone and re-enter. To account for this, the model reduces the expected rate of rush chances shortly following ozone draws. The effects of zone starts diminish as time goes on following the start of the stint, and you can see that in this graph. But to get into more exciting type of modeling, we're going to look at forwards with rush offense. And we see it there plotted as a histogram. You can see there's a couple outliers. Possibly a mistake? No, it's just Connor McDavid doing his thing. And we're going to look at Connor McDavid a little bit more. And I've kind of layered in a couple of tracking. There's a way to look at the landmarks, the 2D, as you'll watch the play. And this is, we could just have 25 minutes of us watching highlights, right? I don't even have to talk. So really, when you see that level of eliteness, you realize that, yeah, it's a small tail and maybe a few are out there, but it's certain with data that we can show you just how elite he is. Note that the whiskers show a range that has 95% of containing their true talent level. So someone like Gaudreau and maybe McKinnon, who's right at the bottom, are interchangeable since their intervals overlap for the most part. So no use in having these debates on Twitter about 9/10 of this list. There's one, and then there's the rest. This is nice to know. Here's to effect on 5v5, even strength, rush, expected goals for. So now we get into model simulation and the importance of line mate quality. And one benefit of this model is that we can simulate hypothetical rush results for specific groups of skaters. So you can imagine the amount of people that want us to simulate a certain player with average teammates. And of course, I have no idea why, default to Zach Kassian, who just signed for $12.8 million. And this is the second conference I've been making fun of him. But he makes $12.8 million, and he could be up here making fun of me. So we need to know that he plays a significant share of his ice time, with Draisaitl, a German, leading the league, Connor McDavid, second in the league, elite players, goal scorers. So the question is, how would his results change with average line mates in their place? And the great thing about analytics is we can actually simulate that. So we'll watch it. Total 5-on-5 ice time, minutes at the bottom, and expected goals off the rush per 60 minutes. And the simulation, I think, is pretty obvious. You see the difference? Kassian, McDavid, Draisaitl in blue, Kassian average teammates in red. So on ice, rush expected goals rate drops by 41% with average line mates. That's $12.8 million there for you. But to end, I would also like to keep giving a hat tip to Connor McDavid, identifying generational talent with these 3 years of data. As I said, though, we collect extensive junior data, so we've actually been able to model him back to his Erie Otter days and find, what makes him unique, going straight through junior into now his NHL career. So it's really cool to have that robust of a data set that we're able to look at him not only, as a elite scorer in the NHL, but as a young teenager and see the impact that he has made over the years. So there's a 95% chance that Connor McDavid's impact on the rate of rush expected goals is greater than 44%. So with that, how often would we expect to see a skater as dominant on the rush as McDavid? Conservatively, we would expect to observe a rush talent as good as Connor McDavid based on the data once for every 7,500 skaters to play in the NHL. Now, how many players have you think have played ever? Yellow numbers. It's pretty close. Any other guesses? 11,000? 7,000 skaters have graced the ice in the league's history. So that leaves us to say that we may never see another rush talent like Connor McDavid in our lifetime. And that's exactly how I want to end this presentation. Hockey is a great game, a very international game, and I hope that I've inspired a few of you, whether you're, NFL, football, baseball, to come over to the dark side and help us develop more Connor McDavids. Thank you. I guess we can take questions too if you have a, sure.
Where does all that tag play-by-play data come from? Because I've seen the NHL API and not all that's in there.
Yes, so we've created software over the years. Honestly, it probably started 12, 13 years ago. We started with our first idea of how to speed up the process of tagging and collecting better data. And then we've been trying to automate every sort of process that we can, straight down to locations of every player's, different observations, and trying to be as detailed as possible and not put our ideas of what certain plays are, but just put the location in an event and then allow algorithms to define what those event types are.
Is there a way for you to measure the impact of that such an application as well as forward? Is there a way to measure that player impact?
Great question. Thank you for being here too. I love seeing younger people. Yeah, of course. There's all sorts of ways that you can look at data, especially when you have when you're looking at the game from not just a box score, which is traditionally looking at, scoring chances. So when you have all the other types of movements and events that have happened, could be in the defensive zone, could be with a defenseman, you can do models that answer any question you would like to have with maybe some uncertainty or a lot of uncertainty, but you can get a great answer for sure. Any other questions?
Do you have any results where you can talk about rush goals versus the total number of goals that happen in a game? This is a very clear example of how awesome Connor McDavid is. But
right.
all the rest of the teams are going to try to win anyway. And so.
Yeah, I don't have it within this presentation, but there's definitely a certain amount of rush goals versus, goals that are in set plays, even a certain amount of goals that happen after, you enter the offensive zone. And I think it actually declines with how long you've been in the offensive zone for your chance at getting a goal. So rush chances and chances of having goalie movement and, different types of passing all increase your expected goals. So your ability to score goals.
So you rag on passing a little bit.
He's easy. Yeah.
Right now he's playing with two. You could debate them as the two best players in the world. Where do you think where do athletes have, just out of curiosity, as his true A/B value? If you know.
Yeah, we do those type of calculations, but with the caveat that it just matters depending upon what the team is looking for. So maybe within that line, he's the type of player that will go into the corners and have certain skill sets that someone like a Connor McDavid either is lacking or doesn't have the physicality for. So it's not that you would rank them per se, but for a team, that's maybe how you can build a line combination that ends up with the overall goal of the style of play that you want. Right.
Have you, in your model, do you break it down any further than D zone, neutral zone, O zone?
We break it down exactly by location, so it can be as detailed as you want, which I think makes it really powerful too, because as you said, yeah, the first example is just like a really fun, like exciting highlight, but there's a lot that happens in terms of different types of rush opportunities. Sure.
Can you look at this at the junior level or college and evaluating your players as well?
For sure, and I think that's incredibly important, which is why it's great that we collect data for, years and years on junior type player, and we can see like the different style of play and what actually translates into the NHL, look at specific skill sets, and also like follow their career as well. If there's areas that they either decline in or increase in, depending upon who they're playing with, who they're playing, what team they're playing on, and what type of college program or even national program did they play on. It's important. Okay, great. Well, thank you for all the questions. And yeah, go Connor McDavid.
All right, if everybody can take their seats, please. So thanks again for joining us for another Competitive Advantage talk here at the 2020 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. The Competitive Advantage talks are brought to you by the Craft Analytics Group. My name is Matt Cabrera. I'm a second-year MBA student at MIT, and it's my pleasure to introduce our presentation, Storytelling Lessons Learned from the Bullet Man and Sue Bird. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Shira Springer, from a sports and society reporter at WBUR, to the stage.
Thank you, Matt, for the introduction. Now, I'm sure some of you might be wondering, what exactly does a sports and society reporter for public radio do? Well, I'm in the storytelling business, and my job is to find great stories, hopefully great stories, and figure out a way to tell them that's compelling and engaging and captures the attention of local and national audiences. But to do that, we have to use data a little differently. So the focus of this talk is to explain how public radio uses data differently, what data holds value and what data doesn't, and why. So to start out with, I'd wanted to give a little bit of industry context, big picture here. I think we all know that the way we consume sports has dramatically changed over the last decade or two, and with that, so has sports journalism. I don't need to tell you this, but data-driven stories are everywhere. So are narrative stories. They're gaining in popularity all the time. I think that's in part due to the popularity of podcasts and documentary series like 30 for 30. I also think that everything is fair game when you're doing narrative stories. There's a lot of territory out there. And when you have such a crowded media landscape, you can find different stories to tell, and media outlets can really develop a distinctive brand through storytelling. Okay, so you know I'm in the storytelling segment here, the narrative storytelling segment, and I'll admit I personally have a love-hate relationship with data. I don't know if I should say that so loudly here. But I know I need the numbers. I've been a participant in this conference. This is my 14th year, and I know there's value in the data. But I also see storytelling as a craft, as an art form. And there's a part of me that doesn't want the numbers interfering with the art. So the way I look at data is I'm not data-driven, but I'm data-influenced. So the goal here is to show you how data influences my work throughout the storytelling process, from how I find stories, to how I tell stories, to how I measure the success of stories. And here comes some numbers for you. And one of the numbers that I really wanted to draw your attention to are the podcast numbers. Because one, it shows you that NPR is pretty darn good at telling stories. #1 podcast publisher in the US. And also it shows you that there's quite a large audience for that kind of storytelling. Now, how does this influence my work? Well, I will tell you, at the station, we talk constantly about our stories and doing them in podcast style. What does that mean? Well, it often means making them very immersive. It could be the way we set up a scene. It could be embedding music in a story. Those are two very simple options of how we make it podcast style. But what's interesting to me is we talk about making it podcast style as if it's something new, but it actually reflects the storytelling objectives of NPR that have been long-held objectives of NPR. And those storytelling objectives are, #1, create driveway moments. So in case you're not familiar, driveway moments are those moments when maybe you're coming home from a long day of work and you put on public radio and you start to hear a story, you pull into your driveway, the story's still going, and you sit there parked listening for the story to finish. That's the ultimate goal. We want to hook listeners and have them keep coming back again and again. And how do we do that? By being immersive and intimate and impactful. What's immersive? We spend a lot of time figuring out how to bring listeners into the scene. All those door knocks you hear, or doors opening, or those phones ringing, or those candid conversations you hear in the background, that's all part of creating an atmosphere in the story that really draws in listeners. And also, we have the benefit of using the human voice a lot in our audio stories. And there is, for my money at least, nothing more intimate than the human voice. And then distinctive narratives. It's as simple as this, and we say this all the time at this station. Zig when others zag. It's sort of a little bit of our motto at public radio. So from there, I thought you'd have fun with this. This is another way in a sort of a big scale that data influences the work that I do in storytelling work. This is the morning edition clock, actually, the new morning edition clock. And this was heavily influenced by data. And I'm sure you're now wondering, well, how? The data was unstructured data, textual data. It was listener complaints. So the old style clock basically felt choppy to listeners. They thought it was distracting. They thought there were too many promotions embedded in the clock. And so NPR decided they were going to redesign that, and they redesigned it specifically for deeper dives into stories, for those driveway moments that NPR knows is its brand. So, thought that's interesting. Now, we've done the industry level, we've done the NPR level, and now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty and the story level. I think you're all probably familiar with the two ways that we use numbers in storytelling. First, they're the numbers you put in stories, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the numbers we use to measure the success of stories. We'll get to that in a moment. But I came from the Boston Globe, 19 years as a sports reporter there, where I would say we were a pretty data-driven organization by the end of my time there. Obviously, we liked a lot of numbers in our stories when appropriate. And when I arrived at public radio at WBUR here in Boston, one of the first lessons I learned was less is more. And it came through this story I did on Rich Hill when he was pitching with the Dodgers. We brought him into the studio for an interview, and it's going to be a story about the ups and downs in his career. He had just signed his big contract with the Dodgers. It was also going to be about the loss of his infant son. And we're putting the story together, and a producer says to me, do you really think we need his ERA in this story? And I was just about floored. But it goes to show you the kind of thinking with radio storytelling, which is they really want to pull back on the numbers. We did put the ERA in the story, rest assured. And the other thing that we talk a lot about when we're dealing with numbers in the radio world and in audio storytelling is, can you make numbers visual? A good example of this is very simple, almost cliche example is if you're dealing with volume, how many pools does it fill? Big volume. If you're dealing with length, how many football fields? And then another lesson that I learned at public radio was beware of too many voices. This is a little bit of a quirky numbers lesson, but too many voices are a problem. They overwhelm the human ear. So one voice, okay. Two voices, okay. Three voices, getting a little risky, and four voices, most editors will say, enough. No more than four voices in a 4 to 8 minute story. So that's a little bit of the NPR world and numbers. Okay, now the numbers that measure success. Two questions usually hang over journalists. What will audiences want? Why will audiences care? And in the what will audiences want category, and I'm using this term volume of attention metrics. It's sort of my mashup of volume metrics and attention metrics. It's basically the numbers you use to measure interest. Now, here's a question for you. I'm going to toss it out to you. If we're in Boston, and if we only did feature stories on the player in the Boston area who rated the highest when it came to volume metrics and attention metrics, who do you think would be the focus of all of our stories? Did I hear a Tom Brady there? You didn't even give me a chance to get a sip of my water. Yeah, Tom Brady. And Tom Brady would probably be number 1, number 2, and number 3. And so I was thinking, well, what's the only thing that could top Tom Brady. And I looked at the metrics and I'm like, okay, and it turns out it's this. Tom Brady and a puppy. Because animals and Tom Brady rate incredibly high. Now, on the other side of the equation, you have instinct and experience. And oftentimes, people see that as a big question mark. It can be very subjective. I look at it as you know it when you see it. And in my radio career so far, there hasn't been a story that's been a better example of you know it when you see it than the Bullet Man. And that's where we're going to go next. So, this is the story of Dennis Rainier. And in 1978, Dennis was running the Grand Valley Marathon. And around mile 10, something hit him in the head. He wasn't quite sure what it was. He thought it might be a rock, maybe part of a brick. He was just absolutely puzzled by what it could be. He put his hand up to his head, and he started feeling around. There was this huge goose egg on the top of his head, but he decided to keep running even though it was a struggle. And I'm actually going to let Dennis tell the story from here. You can play that Bullet Man clip.
I was losing about 15, 20 seconds a mile. I was getting frustrated. Further on I got, the more wobbly I got. I had a little trouble focusing my eyes. And again, I was trying to rationalize what in the world happened here.
Dennis slowed to a walk around the 20-mile mark.
It was only to see if it would clear my head and give me some better focus. But never did the thought occur to me, well, I better sit or quit or take a ride or bail. That never even occurred to me, actually.
And why was that? Why didn't that occur to you?
Well, it's either stupidity or dedication. You can take your pick. Probably stupidity more than anything.
So you get a good sense of what happened and also a good sense of Dennis from that clip. Now, Dennis finishes the marathon in 3:09, and he's pretty disappointed. His wife comes up to him. He had expected to run under 3 hours. And she says, "What happened? I thought you were going to run much faster." And he says, "I don't know. Something hit me in the head at mile 10. And his wife says, you might want to go to the race doctor and get that checked out. So reluctantly, Dennis goes to the race doctor and gets it checked out. And the race doctor starts poking and prodding around in the top of his head. And he says, "I think you've been shot." And he says, "I see something silver and shiny embedded in your skull. You should go to the hospital." So Dennis and his wife drive to the hospital, and that's where that x-ray was taken. And lo and behold, Dennis had been shot in the head at some point during the race, around the 10-mile mark. They get the bullet removed at the hospital. It becomes a police investigation. And there are two theories about what happened. At least the police have one theory, and Dennis has another. So the police think that it was an errant bullet from a hunter, a nearby, hunter who was near the race course. The race course did run through some rural countryside. Dennis, however, a couple days after news broke about what happened to him, received a call. It was a mysterious caller. And this caller tells him, I was running about your pace at the 10-mile mark, and I have some people out to get me. And I think you may have gotten a bullet that was intended for me. So that completely freaked out Dennis. But nobody ever solved the case. It's an open case to this day. I talked to the sheriff's officer who worked on it. But you're all probably wondering now, okay, great story. What does this have to do with how data influences storytelling? Well, here's how. Going back to what do audiences want? And if you look at some numbers, these are just some very simple numbers. If you look up how many the most popular podcasts, you see that 16 of the 25, true crime and mystery. Meanwhile, not so much interest in marathon or running in the podcast world. Okay, great. So when I'm doing this story, it's a 10-minute story. How do I want to structure it? Well, it's not like I consulted the podcast charts, but if you're working in public radio, you know what's popular in the audio storytelling world. And I was like, okay, this is not a marathon story, this is a true crime story. So it's a 10-minute story, 7 minutes are focused on the mystery and the true crime elements of what happened to Dennis. And so one way of thinking about the way that data influences storytelling is it points you in a promising direction. It doesn't tell me how to write the story or really how to structure the story, but it says, you might want to head in this way. Also, I should have, interest of full disclosure here, I'm a marathoner. My personal bias was, and believe me, I asked Dennis about the marathon for about 30 minutes in our interview. I wanted every little detail. So my personal bias was, I want lots of marathon details. But I knew, given the data, probably not the wisest way to go. All right, so this is a great example of little-known athlete, little-known story. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what happens when you have a well-known athlete. An athlete, quite frankly, who's overcovered. And that brings us to Pedro Martinez. So Pedro came into the studio for an interview. This was during the 2018 season. And talk about overcovered. I don't know if he declined any interview requests that summer. And so there was a lot of material out there. And of course, we wanted to do something different and be distinctive. So again, going back to that unstructured data approach, that textual data, I looked up what had been written. I watched interviews. And I saw he talked a lot about the 2018 Red Sox, a lot about Alex Cora, a lot about Chris Sale, a lot about what it was like to pitch in the World Series. And I thought, okay, well-covered topics. Then I met with a few baseball fans at the station, and we just started bouncing around ideas, and silly things came up like, I wonder if he likes it when the crowd sings Sweet Caroline. And so I started going through my head, and I'm thinking, all right, music, Pedro, I wonder what kind of music he's like. I don't see anybody asking him in these interviews about his musical tastes. So it led to this moment in my interview with Pedro.
If you had a walk-on song today, what would it be?
El cantante.
Can you sing that for us?
Yo soy el cantante que hoy han venido a escuchar lo mejor del repertorio. A ustedes voy a brindar.
And can you translate?
You know what that song means? That I'm the artist that you pay to come and see perform, and that I'm gonna actually show you the best of me and the best of my repertoire at the time I come out. And there's no time for sadness, there's no time for anything else but to perform.
So that's a side of Pedro you rarely get to see, and I think you can say that the data influenced the direction of that interview in a very subtle way. So what about athletes that probably should be better known, who are undercovered, but pro-level athletes? And that brings us to the other person in the title of this talk, Sue Bird. And one of the statistics you may be familiar with about women's sports coverage is that only 4% of sports media coverage in the US is devoted to women's sports. And it was a subject I talked to Sue Bird about in an interview, and basically, she said, we don't get our stories told, it affects the interest in our game, it also leads to a lot of misconceptions. And it ties into this talk because what stood out to me, or what stands out to me, is when you're telling stories, when you're looking for stories, you not only have to use data differently, you have to think about data differently. And part of thinking about data differently is thinking about what's not there, what's not covered, and maybe the statistics you don't see. So it brings up an important point. Think about numbers differently. Remember, what's not there matters. In addition to stories that aren't covered or areas that aren't covered, I'll give you a statistical example. Let's say you have a city that was an athletic powerhouse and produced tons of pro athletes year after year after year after year. And then suddenly there's a fall off. They're no longer producing pro athletes It just drops off and there's a drought for years. Well, if I'm seeing those numbers, it makes me question what happened in that city. And I'll bet you, if you go behind those numbers, you will find a great story there. It might be a great story at the intersection of sports and culture, or sports and politics, or sports and business. But there's something there in the absence of those numbers, and I think that's important to remember. Also tied in with that is sports and society stories in particular, stories at the intersection of sports and society, are there oftentimes to create interest rather than reflect it. And that leads to different measures of success. And that's the measure of impact. Again, a couple simple examples. If you're doing a story about, let's say, a youth football player, right? And it's a concussion story, and you follow him through concussion rehab, and he keeps, suffering from headaches and sensitivity to light, and you really just document this kid's struggle. Well, part of it is, you want people to read about this kid, but another measure of the success of that story is if it has an impact. Do the rules change? Do the medical protocols at his school change or in his league change? So think about ways to measure success differently. That's just one way. And there are lots of examples that you can think of where you're measuring success differently. Another one, an underfunded inner city league, you profile that. Well, when the story comes out, does the funding change for that league? Again, thinking about impact as a measure of success. All right, this is the portion of the talk where I give you some storytelling tips, I hope, tips. And I like to say it's the please do try this at home portion. First off, what I've been talking about all along, which is this immersive quality. You want to bring audiences along for the ride. So you should look for topics or issues or access that allows you to bring audiences along for the ride. Again, I know we're often talking about data-driven stories, but sometimes it's good to let the number support the narrative, not vice versa. And then the bottom two I think are the most important. You want to seek out the unexpected, the anomalies, things that are a bit mysterious about the numbers, because behind that you will find great stories. And then finally, this is a big one for me, try to figure out why the audience will care. Because if you can tap into why the audience cares, if you can tap into an emotional connection to your story, then that's going to help you create something that's compelling and engaging and really connects. And with that, I will take some questions. Questions? I can't see you because the lights are so bright, but yes. I don't know if there's a microphone or not.
Sure, we have something in common. I was a sports writer for over 20 years.
Great.
Yeah, mostly at the Indianapolis Star before I moved
Bob
into...
Kravitz's country, right?
I know Bob pretty well, actually. Yeah, but he's now at the Athletics, so he's moved on as well. And I left a few years ago, and now in communications for a labor union. But I don't know if this is related to sports, but I really was struck by your listing of the most popular podcasts and the storytelling. And one thing, I've become a podcast freak that I've kind of found very cool about it. There's still there seems to be an appetite for hard news or in-depth stories, whether they're sports related or not. For instance, the New York Times is the Daily is almost #1 every day, and I listen to it all the time and stuff. Have you found that to be the case? That there's a chance to be a little more serious and more of a platform to tell your story, maybe in a little more serious way than in the past?
Yes, I think the other 9, or maybe 7 of the 9 that weren't true crime, were the Daily, Up First, NPR's news podcast, other sort of where they talk about issues, and then there were a couple of comedy podcasts thrown in. So the question is, are there opportunities to be a little more serious? Well, I think some of the stories, yes, Bullet Man is fun, Pedro singing El Cantante is fun, but, a lot of what I do takes stuff from the news and then tells a serious story, but still a story. Just an example off the top of my head, right around the time of Colin Kaepernick and talk about race and politics and sports, we did a piece for Only a Games show, and it was on the Syracuse 8 And they were sort of, the way we framed it was, they were college students who had boycotted the team at Syracuse and because of what they perceived as racial inequities. And we framed it as, these players were Colin Kaepernick before Colin Kaepernick. So serious and storytelling. And I'd like to think you can be serious and tell stories. And that's a nice little combination. Yeah.
The cops talk a lot about failures, but so how many stories do you chase that don't end up with a bullet man on the other side? Go with, or?
I learned my lesson the hard way. I will not reveal the name of what happened. We had this idea to follow a very high-level college recruit. He ended up going to a top 25 college program. Football recruit, spent a day with him, watched him work, and I was checking in with him every 3-4 months or so. We started in the summer. I was actually probably every couple of months and talked to the parents and the coaches and had all this great material. And it was as it was drawing closer and closer to National Signing Day, we kept the responsiveness was less and less. So the story never aired. So it's not a question of like the story not panning out. It's sort of like you have this great idea of like really bringing the audience there and not only bringing them along for the ride in a very short moment, but we wanted to bring them along for the year preceding his commitment to a major college program. And at about the 9th month, it fell through. So that's more my experience with failure. With something like the Bullet Man before, we do a lot of pre-interviewing in radio, so I got Dennis on the phone, and as soon as I got him on the phone, and I could see the way he was sort of no big deal about getting shot in the head, I was like, oh, this is going to be an interesting guy to talk to. So a lot of it is pre-interview to make sure you don't fail. Yeah?
That 4% statistic, is that across all media platforms?
I believe so, yes.
And is it storytelling of women in sports and female athletes much different than the storytelling of in your experience?
So in my experience, yeah, I was going to say, well, how long do you have? So in my experience, and to answer your first question, is the storytelling about female athletes in women's sports different? Yes, it is different. We use different words. I think this is well documented, though I think it's changing a bit, focus more on appearance with female athletes, use different adjectives. We'll talk more about a male athlete's strength and aggressiveness and praise that, and it's not the same with women. And there's a whole sort of almost separate vocabulary that we use in describing women versus male athletes. Some of that's changing because there's more consciousness about it. But the thing is, it shouldn't be that way. I think that's sort of the answer to your second question, which it's changing, but it shouldn't be that way. And how do we change that? I think there's a lot. First of all, it's education, it's awareness, it's just being conscious of it. I think we've simply got to do more of it, and we've got to convince, we shouldn't have to convince, but I think the word is convince, more editors, more people in power that, who are the decision makers, that we need more women's sports coverage, and above all, we need more female decision makers in these media outlets. Period, full stop there. Any other questions? It's so hard to see here. Yeah. Oh, microphone is coming.
So in continuation of that, how much of that needs to be story building versus storytelling? I guess the thing in that context, when you think of, let's just take a superhero movie, if you will. There's the background story movie, and then there's the movie where the Avengers come in together and defeat the big boss, if you will.
So origin stories.
Exactly.
I get the superhero thing.
I'm a huge women's sports fan, so I go looking for the origin story.
And that's fantastic. And we need more origin stories, and I think the way we get more origin stories is when we get more consistent coverage. Because when coverage is here and there, or we're just covering a championship series or a big rivalry, you focus on that big rivalry and you don't have time to really dig deep. But if news organizations commit to consistent coverage throughout the season, it gives you time to do the origin stories that are so valuable and again, help the audience connect on a deeper level to the athletes and to the game. Any other questions? I know we're kind of out of time. Wow. Oh, okay. No. Any other question? Getting them in the El Cantante mode? Well, I will say this, and I didn't think this when I started in public radio, but bringing an athlete into a studio is very, very helpful. I will say that I did an interview with Pedro the year before at Fenway Park, and we were sitting, I think we were sitting in the dugout, and it was just sort of, he was in ball player mode, even though he was retired. So I think this is not necessarily a strategy, but in some ways removing them from the atmosphere of the sport, of being a ball player. Same thing happened with Rich Hill. I didn't play the clip or put the clip in, but he started, he got emotional, teared up is the way we phrased it in the story. I'm not so sure that would have happened if we held the interview at a ballpark. So trying to apply that, if you're stuck in a locker room, perhaps ask questions that take them, that aren't sport focused, that sort of, if you can't physically remove them from the locker room, try to mentally put them in a different headspace if possible. That's the first strategy. Okay, so I'm getting like bright red flashing lights. I think we're gonna have to call it, but thank you all, and I'll stick around if you have questions, more questions.